The passion, the energy, the power, the spirit of hardcore.
Thank you, Uri. I hope I don't disappoint. So thanks for coming to the presentation. Before I start, I will give a quick introduction to myself. So I'm Rachel Rose O'Leary. I'm a programmer. I work on DarkFi. I'm also the editor of a philosophy journal called Agorism in the 21st Century, which you can buy in physical form at the shop here at Polis. And we also announced at this conference with a few posters a call for submissions for the 4th issue, which is a more practical approach than previous issues. So we're looking for submissions on agorist strategies and tactics. So we're just about putting the finalizing touches on the 3rd issue, which is on network states that should come out at the end of the year. I'll also say that I've got a really cool t-shirt, and if you want one, you can also buy them at the front of the conference in the shop. It helps support the project. And shout out to ZK Armour, our art director, for making these beautiful designs. How many people in this room have heard of DarkFi before? Okay, that's almost pretty much, maybe even everyone. How many people then feel like they have a good technical understanding of what DarkFi is? Yeah, relatively much less. So I will try to do 2 things in this talk. The first half, I'm going to talk through a bit of history and just kind of tell a story and analysis of the past 500 years and where I think we're going in the next 500 years. But for the second half of the talk, I will also talk about DarkFi and try to explain kind of what it is on a technical level. And I hope that through the talk, you'll start to understand why these 2 strands are connected. Okay. So I wanted to dedicate this talk to Terry Davis, who says that genius is 99% divine inspiration, 1% perspiration. So he has this nice quote about a bird looking at the monitor, and he's saying, you know, the bird can't really figure out what's going on. Maybe we are also like this bird. We're just kind of looking at the monitor, trying to make sense, and maybe we can have some bird ideas. You know, maybe that's all we can do. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and I just wanted to kind of preface the talk with this notion. I also want to mention Desmond Fennell, who was a big inspiration. He's an Irish philosopher who died 3 years ago, and he's a big inspiration for this talk. So to clear up a little bit definitions before I get deep into the talk, these 2 terms are often confused. So states and nations are not the same thing. A state can be understood as a kind of system of government or a mechanism of government. A nation is, you know, a people that have a shared kind of worldview or self-image that everyone within that nation kind of, you know, believes in or participates in. Nations can also consist of many different nations. So you can have communities within communities inside of a nation. Nation states are states which emerged in modernity and basically fused aspects of both of these things. So they took the system of governance and they infused it with a particular kind of cultural identity that they saw as representative of the nation. But I'll try to explain that this process was was not truly representative of the nation, and that actually waged war with society in some ways. I'll also mention the word government. So government tends to mean something like the the people inside of the state, the people that comprise the state. So that's different to governance and the notion of self-governance, which is, agency and decision-making that flows upward from communities. So the government is something that kind of operates on society like an object, whereas self-governance is something that comes out of society, and society is the subject of the self-governance. So I just wanted to clarify those terms. Some more terms that, if you've seen me talk before, or if you've seen Amir's talks, you may have encountered this term desert and another term forest. So we often use this metaphor. We say that surveillance is a desert because it's monopolizing tendency that reduces everything to a kind of single hegemonic and uniform state. Forests, on the other hand, are something pluralistic and multipolar, which have a level of richness and depth that the desert doesn't have. So we say anonymity is a kind of forest, whereas surveillance is a desert and creates deserts. In this talk, I will be talking a little bit like the history of forests and deserts in an expanded sense of the term. So not just thinking about anonymity and surveillance, but also more broadly, the different kinds of cultural and political, linguistic forests that we have seen and lost. So this is a statement that desertification is the basic process of the age. So I'm going to interrogate this throughout the rest of the talk. I think, there is truth to that, but I'm going to kind of argue against it in some ways. So I'm going to basically argue that this has been the basic social process of the age, but that the age is changing. So this is a graph that I put together some statistics. So this is you can see. Oh, I have this thing here. These are the labels. So we've got Ireland, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. This is the number of self-governance facilities per capita since 1900. So I think this is a really interesting kind of angle on a process that doesn't just occur in terms of these self-governance facilities, but also occurs in many different aspects of society. So I see this is like an illustration of what I've been talking about, this process of desertification. When we talk about self-governance and the facilities of self-governance, I'm talking about local governance structures. So when we see this decline of local governance structures, you could kind of incorrectly think that we're talking about that in a way governance has declined, and that's a good thing because we're anti-government. But I want to make a point here, which is that what this really represents is the aggregation of government and decision-making power in the centers and the monopolies of state power and away from the communities. So we're seeing a decline in local autonomy over time. And this has corresponded to a decline in linguistic, so language diversity, different languages being spoken, cultural diversity, and also ecosystem diversity. Forests in a literal sense have also seen the same kind of dramatic decline. And I show this graph, and this is looking particularly at Ireland and Britain. But it's actually an example of a much bigger global process and also a pan-European process. So this is a little snapshot, but it's a much bigger thing. And I will be referring consistently to this example throughout this presentation, just as a kind of an anchor, but it's much bigger than that as well. So this is a really interesting quote that kind of blew my mind when I read it. So this is a guy, Sanders Lewis, And he's talking about basically the dual nature of nationalism. So he says, he's talking in the context of Welsh nationalism. He's talking to Welsh nationalists in a speech. And he says, like, look, we've seen all this. We've seen the decline of the nobility, the disappearance of the bards, which were the poets. They were part of the old feudal society. We saw the middle class and the wealthy merchants, and they didn't think anything of Welsh culture. And we saw how the language was lost and the education was increasingly made kind of into something Anglo. And we blame this for the decline of like the Welsh culture. But he said that this is a secondary cause. The true cause of this decline is in fact nationalism. So it's a weird statement for a nationalist to make, but essentially he's acknowledging that there are two sides of nationalism. There is the kind of the Welsh nationalism that emerged as a reaction, but prior to that was an English nationalism, which kind of which laid the groundwork for this Welsh nationalism by kind of expanding into Welsh society and causing this decline in cultural diversity. So there's two kinds of nationalism. One is, we can call it imperialist. The other is kind of liberatory. And what's really interesting to me is that there's a kind of feedback where one is actually creating the other. So, we have these kind of imperialist nationalisms, like the English nationalism, which sees its own culture as free and wants to expand freedom to the provinces, what it views as the provinces, the external societies that surround it. So we had this happen with England, where they had this moment of, wow, English culture is great, and this rise of nationalism, and they wanted to expand into the surrounding countries, and that they expanded into Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and that process led to a rise in local nationalisms, which were liberatory nationalisms. So they were less about the imperialism and the expansion, but they were more about, we need to free ourselves from this oppressor that came from the outside. And there's basically a causal relationship between these two kinds of nationalisms. And what's really sad is that there's a kind of a tragic twist to this, where by participating in this process of a liberatory nationalism, where they tried to free themselves from the encroachment of this other nationalism, they themselves began to participate in the decline of kind of regional, cultural, and linguistic diversity. So again, to give you a concrete example, Ireland, when it established its nation state, it did so in reaction to the British nationalism, but it ended up founding a state that is still to this day one of the most centralized in all of Europe. And it failed to rescue the Irish language from extinction for the most part. It waged war on the provinces, and it transformed the kind of the areas outside of the centre, which is Dublin, into a kind of object that were to be developed on, rather than to self-develop. And they aggregated all of the kind of power and decision-making in Dublin, which itself became a kind of just basically a shadow of London. So basically, that was a big failure. So why did it fail? So there's a few reasons why this didn't work out, and I think it's interesting to reflect on them. So there was a split between the conscious desire of the nationalists and their unconscious desires. Consciously, they wanted to create a nation state and be a nation among other nations. Unconsciously, they wanted to create a new image of their life, which would be an image that they would find valuable. So they wanted to bring a new value to their life. They thought that their life had become devalued and disempowered through the imperialist nationalism they experienced. So they wanted to create a new image of life that they could value as a people, and so the tragedy here is that unconscious image of life that they were trying to create ended up mirroring the structure of society and the image that was kind of reflected onto them by the imperialist power in this context, by England. So England saw Ireland as a province that was, incapable of governing themselves, that was backward. And the Irish nationalists basically internalized this unconsciously. And then by failing to recognize that their true goal was to create a new image that was a value-creating image of their lives, they unconsciously basically created this replica that was like a shadow or a reflection of how the English viewed them. So that's like one way that they failed. The other one was that they misunderstood the cause of the desertification that they were trying to fight against. So they misunderstood it, and they thought that by creating a nation state, they could reverse the process. This was self-defeating because the nation state itself, and the accumulation of power within the nation state was part of how the decline was happening. So by creating a nation state is like paradoxical. You can't solve the issues of a nation state by creating a new nation state. So really the true kind of solution would be to restore power to people and communities and to allow them to take agency over their lives, but instead they started participating in the same system of nation states. And obviously that was a lost cause. Finally then, another really sad thing was there was a general failure to cooperate with others that were in a similar situation. So it's tragic, but many times in Irish, Scottish and Welsh history, there were moments where there were opportunities to create a unified front against England, but those opportunities were lost. So I have them written down. I can give you 3 examples. Edward and Robert the Bruce, 2 brothers, very important in the Scottish history. They wanted to create a united Celtic front against England. They weren't able to achieve that. There was a Welsh guy called Owen Glendower who called on the Irish to help them in their war against the English. Ireland didn't answer their call. There was another guy, again Welsh, called Griffith Lude, who apparently also tried to get the Irish to help, and they wouldn't help. And so, why is that? And I think it's because they saw themselves as isolated instances they didn't recognize that this was actually a global process that they were part of. And so this kind of isolation, they ended up seeing themselves as kind of like they're somehow hostile to these other efforts, even though the people, those other countries were going through the exact same thing. And by banding together, they could have changed the course of history. So I think though, and where I'm going with this is that we are genuinely kind of entering a new phase, and we're working our way towards overcoming these problems. And the reason why I think that is because there are several thinkers. I'm just going to show you 3 of them, but there are many more who are making these observations that I'm telling you now. And they're saying, wow, okay, look, here's when we went wrong and we misunderstood this. So they're becoming increasingly conscious of the mistakes. So this is one by a French guy called Jean-François Gravier, who has a book called Paris and the French Desert. So it's appropriately named. And he accuses Paris of behaving like a monopolist group devouring the national substance of France. So there's this kind of a growing awareness that there's a kind of monopolization and extraction from the regions towards the centers. Desmond Fennell, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, says something similar. He says, he's criticizing the nation-state paradigm. He says, a nation is not a mass of powerless citizens and obedient consumers, legitimizing this bureaucratic economic establishment. No, it's what we would propose to build, which is a distinctive community of communities. And he mentions that Gaelic Ireland had been one of those. Achelan, who you may have heard of from me before, is saying a similar thing. And I didn't mention this before, but it's interesting to check the dates of those quotes. The first one was in the 50s, second one was in the 70s. This is from like roughly 10, 15 years ago. But they're all saying similar things. They're becoming aware of the paradoxes of the nation state, and they're analyzing the failures of the nationalism of the past 500 years. And they're recognizing that, basically to be a patriot today requires you to interrogate these problems and to reposition yourself. And, become conscious of those things that those nationalists were completely unconscious of, and therefore unconsciously kind of participated in their own collapse. So I think that we're in the midst of this general paradigm shift. The new millennium and the rise of peer-to-peer anonymous technologies, Linux, and global communication is really going to bring about a new age. And I think politically, this age is going to be defined by the experience of the past 500 years and the critique. When you look at the structure of paradigm shifts, it's the case that a paradigm shift occurs when we begin to formulate our critiques of the previous paradigm. So we start to realize that paradigm is limited, and we start to try to describe where it went wrong, what were its problems. And through that process of describing the mistakes of the old paradigm, we are also creating and laying the groundwork for the next paradigm. So I think that's the process that we're going through now at the moment. And so here's an interesting timeline. There's a weird thing in human history where the number 500 seems to have like seems to play a part in these like transitionary moments. So every 500 years, there's kind of like a transition in human history. And also interesting in human history is that there are moments where we kind of echo previous eras. So the nation-state era that we just kind of came out from saw itself as a kind of neo-Roman Empire. So they were like, Rome was cool, let's do Rome again. So what I think, and now a lot of people talk about the moment being like the end of Rome. So I think there's a real wisdom in that comparison. And I do think we're going through a kind of the end of Neo-Rome, and we're entering a kind of Neo-Dark Age. So that might sound a little bit scary, but it's also a time of great potential. It's going to be a time of transformation and a time of decline. In many ways, we will witness the breakup and reconfiguration of global power, and probably a lot of war and suffering, but also a time of like great cultural and spiritual development, similar to how the Dark Ages were in European history 1,000 years ago. So I don't know if you guys have ever done tarot, but there's a card called the Death card. When you pull a Death card, you're like, oh, that's scary. But really, generally it doesn't mean death. It just means some kind of a irreversible and an absolute transformation. So I think we're going through this kind of process. I'm not sure that we'll see, within our lifetime, we will see all of it. I think it will play out over the next 500 years and more. But we are going through this kind of deep transformation and restructuring, and I think a time of spiritual and cultural development. When I was doing research for this talk, I was reminded of a quote that, or a story that people often say about the Dark Ages in England, where they say that the Anglo-Saxons were wandering around and they see the ruins of Rome, and that rumors kind of spread among the people that these were the ruins built by giants, and that the people had forgotten how to build them, so they just thought it must be like a huge class of like superhumans, like giants, like enormous human size, that would build these ruins. But I started researching this because I was like, I wonder if that's us, you know, like we've already started to look back at some of these like marvels of human engineering and architecture. We're like, wow, look at that cathedral. Like we couldn't build that now. Everything now just looks like this, like very bland, like shiny surfaces. We've lost that, you know, that spiritual motivation, and, you know, that non-economic kind of mindset that would allow us to build such like architectural wonders and works of art and so on. But when I started looking into that story, I found that historically it's kind of disputed. So there was a poet who described the ruins as being built by giants, but he seemed to have meant it in like a metaphorical sense, where he was like, these were like the giants of industry. They were like, you know, these huge cultural figures, but he didn't seem to mean they're like mythical giants. There may have been people who believed in the mythical giants, but it's not known whether that was all people. There was definitely some people who knew about Rome, and, you know, knew their history and knew that this was the former age that they were seeing in the ruins. What I thought was really interesting, though, is that one source I read was saying that there were some people that even celebrated the ruins, because they were like, the ruins of Rome that we are walking through is a symbol of our victory as Christians against the pagan era. So they liked to walk amongst the ruins and kind of reflect on how they had reigned triumphant and the Roman era had fell. So I wonder, you know, if the next 500 years there'll be similar experiences with the ruins of the nation-state age around us. Okay, so these are some kind of like perspectival shifts that will play a part in the coming age. So yeah, it's about, you know, restoring power to the peripheries and making people agents of their own lives, to reverse these processes of desertification that have been playing out over 500 years and really much longer as well. And to restore some of these forests, you know, in an expanded sense, the forests of language, culture, plant, animal diversity, and so on. And really it's about kind of restoring the future and the ability to kind of redirect the future and create new futures. So these are some of the, earlier on I spoke about the failures of nationalism. I kind of analyzed it. So this is like an inversion of that. You know, they had this unconscious desire, so we're trying to become more conscious, you know, before where they were isolated, we're trying to work together and retain a global perspective, become cooperative, and also, you know, to move away from confusion towards directed action. Yes, and so these are some of the goals that we're working towards. So like the general, okay, so I mentioned that I may not have mentioned, but by taking powers away from the peripheries and centering them in like a center like Dublin or London, or, you know, now increasingly the US is kind of like the new monopoly, and everywhere has become a kind of a province of the US. Even European nations are obsessed with the US politics, even though they can't vote or have any like say in it really, or not really part of it, but it influences them as well, because really they're just a province of this great empire called the US. And so by taking the power away from people, and also by treating them like slave people and like cattle, and by surveilling them and so on, there is a feedback loop where you actually kind of make them more slavish and cattle-like. So there is a kind of easy fix to this, which is by restoring tools of power to people. we have the possibility of actually like reactivating them in the same kind of feedback, where like having access to power actually makes people more activated and more powerful. Hello. Thank you. Okay. So this is like the opposite thing of what I said earlier. So the claim is basically that reforestation is the basic process of the next 500 years. I didn't talk about DarkFi yet, but DarkFi is trying in a small way to make this happen. The connection is like, again, to do with these loops. So by restoring the power to people and giving them tools, we're actually participating in the kind of in multipolarity and in restoring agency to people. So that's really our goal. So we don't need permission to do this. This is the great lesson of the parallel polis. We can already start building and living this parallel society. And the very act of doing that radically reorients the world toward a multi-centered paradigm. So a kind of pluralist paradigm, a great forest where the center is nowhere and the periphery is everywhere. So yeah, we're really, DarkFi is building the tools for this, and we're very interested in this kind of like self-conscious, self-regeneration of society. So we want to equip people with the tools to free themselves. These tools are peer-to-peer and anonymous, and they're centered around anonymous coordination. So what that means is like, imagine you are an emergent nation that's coming into consciousness, and you want to create a parallel society. We want to provide you with all the tools so you can do that. So you can communicate anonymously, you can send money around anonymously. You also have native DAO tooling. So that means whoever in your organization or collective can cooperate over a treasury. And we also have anonymous task management. So it's really about how do you create nations and projects that can decouple from the existing order through this like peer-to-peer anonymous paradigm where it's impossible to censor. And so, I gave a kind of an abstract maybe example of a parallel society that's like reaching self-consciousness and wants to form and become a part of this reforestation. But there are other practical and kind of like more relatable and real examples today, which is, increasingly a lot of people are being arrested for wrongthink. They can use these, and if they're not happy with their government, they can, pool money together using the DAO, and they can concretely organize to enact change that they want to see. So it plays a role today as well. You may have seen these posters around. So we just announced our first user-facing product, which some of you may have, I hope, compiled DarkIRC. But previously, and still to have a fully featured DarkIRC, you need to compile it on command line. But we made an app, which is just plug and play. So it's an APK, you can install it, it's cross-platform, works on mobile phone, and any desktop, Windows, Mac, Linux, and you just install it, and it's an executable, you just run it. So this is the very first version of DarkFi in a way, but we're slowly expanding it with new features. So right now it's just a chat, and it's limited to a single channel. But that's just because it's like an alpha pre-release. But slowly we're going to be adding new functionality. And eventually the vision is that you will have like this chat app, and you can also send money around to your friends, and you can operate your DAO through there. And you can have task management systems and so on. So it's like really, and we want to minimize as much as possible the steps. So it's really just like a question of like running an app and just like minimizing clicks as much as possible. So, you know, we are focused very much on user experience, but we also have a critique of the existing UI paradigm, which is all about like making people stupid with these like bubbly interfaces and so on. So like we want things to be like informationally rich, and for people to be empowered. That's like the most important design goal that we have. So for the people, for all of you, I guess, who don't really know what's going on with DarkFi technically, I will now explain a little bit what's going on. This is DarkFi architecture. You can see we have core library. That's what creates nodes, and then we have the front ends also. So there's like 3 things to point out about the core library, which I don't know if you can see that, but you know, we've got peer-to-peer network. Originally took a lot of design inspiration from the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, but we've modified it. We rewrote the Bitcoin. It was the lib Bitcoin, if you guys know that, written in C++. We took that, rewrote in Rust, added a bunch of stuff from Monero also, which has a very stable peer-to-peer network. We also have pluggable transports, so you can easily use it with Tor or other transport layers. You know, we want to add support for NIM as well. Then we have the blockchain layer, which is using a CPU minimal proof of work algorithm called RandomX. The goal is to release that as a merge mine with Monero, so that we can basically onboard the Monero miners into the DarkFi ecosystem, and to tell them thank you for supporting the Monero network. Anonymous smart contracts, then, you know, that's how we get the programmability. And relatedly, we also have a crypto SDK, which is providing developers with these anonymous toolings that they can use in creating featureful anonymous applications. So on our smart contract architecture, this is an example of our transaction payment scheme in smart contract form. So we have we're based on the sapling payment scheme, which Zcash also uses. So it's a protocol for anonymous transactions. It's got 2 phases, a mint and a burn step. And here you can see the contract code, which has been simplified. It's the first few lines of the contracts for the mint and the burn step that happens in every DarkFi transaction. This is using our own low-level assembly language that we created to compose these ZK proofs. So the way that works is basically you write the code here. Whoops, go back. You write the code here. That gets parsed and then, you know, compiled and runs on this. So the way our ZK VM, the way to think about it really is like there's a ZK assembler and assembly language, and then there's the virtual machine, and we're kind of writing the proofs in this higher level language, which then get compiled down to the ZK machinery, which is using Halo 2. And yep, so in the next slide, oh no, I'll come back to this mint and burn in a sec, and you'll get to see the protocol. So each DarkFi transaction has like, you know, several different elements. Here you see the ZK proofs, which we just talked about there. The smart contracts and signatures, various signatures and fees stuff. So the WASM smart contracts are at the moment written in Rust, but hypothetically, they could be written in any WASM-compatible language. And so these WASM contracts are make use of the ZK proofs and the machinery that I explained in the last slide of the assembler and the virtual machine. So these contracts, where we actually do the the actual logic and execution of smart contracts, is separate to the ZK layer, where we're doing the anonymous protocols. So we do that intentionally. Other projects, such as Aztec, they have a language called Noir. Noir is combining both things. So you're composing smart contracts in a language which is also creating like zero knowledge commitments and so on. They use a Rust-like syntax. We decided to keep these separate because we actually want developers to reason about the anonymous schema that they're using within the Rust smart contracts. So this is a really cool, this is a wormhole. So this is the transaction validation. You can see then the signatures and the WASMs and the WASM smart contracts and the ZK proofs and the fees kind of going like, and like validated onto the blockchain. And that's how validation works on DarkFi. Okay, so I will talk through a couple applications, so to give you guys a bit of intuition maybe to how this works, and I will finish pretty soon, and then you can ask questions. So payments, I mentioned we're using the sapling payment scheme. There's a mint and a burn step. Here, these are the, I showed earlier some contract code that was written in our ZK assembly language. This is the simplified version of the protocol that you saw. So this is the mint state and the mint step and the burn step. So each transaction contains both a mint and a burn. The mint is the output and the burn is the input. So for those Bitcoiners who are familiar with the UTXO, DarkFi is also UTXO. But we have these proofs in the inputs and the outputs. Those proofs are basically a bulla, which is our word for a kind of encrypted hash that contains many. You're committing to a lot of information inside of the hash. So a bulla is a concept from ancient Mesopotamia, where they used to have these like clay balls where they would put all these different financial instruments. So it's kind of like a meta financial object. And so we use that concept here where we talk about these encrypted hashes of attributes. So we have like here in the burn, it's the value like of the coin, how much is coin, the token ID, the serial number, we'll talk about that in a second, and the public key of the person of Alice who's actually sending the money. So that's the step where you're spending essentially the money that you're trying to transfer, and you know there's a serial number here. Basically, this is this value here. So in the mint proof, we create a credential, which is a secret credential that we then make a commitment to, and we broadcast the commitment. It's a encrypted commitment to this secret value. And later, when we want to actually spend it, we reveal that secret value S, which is called a nullifier, and that's how we achieve a double spend protection. So this is kind of like one of the cool things about sapling. So it's unlinkable anonymous transactions. So that's this, and then the mint, which is how like Bob is going to receive the money from Alice. Again, it's another bulla of the token value, coin ID, a new serial number, and Bob's public key. So again, this is basically this. So you're kind of creating a random serial number, making a commitment to that, publishing the commitment. Later you will kind of compute you will do another proof where you compute that this C, which is the coin that was created here, is in fact in the global state. So that's a. If you take a photo of this, I think it's quite easy. You can just read that. It's like explains exactly what the protocol is. Okay. Swaps. Then we also, this is another application we have working on DarkFi at the moment. So it's basically what I just described in terms of payments, but then if you imagine you make the payment in two parts and there's two people and they both kind of construct half a transaction each, and then only when they both sign does the transaction become valid. So this is a native smart contract that we have on DarkFi, where it's part of the native smart contracts, and this allows you to swap anonymously, trustlessly between two different assets, but it does require that two people are online and willing to, sign the transaction, both of them. Okay, then our most exciting and kind of complex application is the DAO product, which is I announced this actually 2 years ago at HCPP. What the DAO is, it's a on-chain encrypted treasury that can be operated on according to rules set by the DAO when the DAO is created. And why that's really interesting is you can have DAOs with any number of people, any number of participants. All of the participants are anonymous, as in, like, there's nothing on-chain about those people. All of the activities of the DAO are anonymous, so like the sending money to and from, it's all, the blockchain on DarkFi is just like, encrypted hashes. So you don't see anything about what's going on with the transactions and to do with the DAO. So you also have this whole machinery with this DAO product, so you have a number of people that are participants within a DAO, which essentially means they have the ability to create proposals and vote on proposals related to the DAO. And then you have some people who have like a particular kind of, there's like a hierarchy of roles within the DAO. And so people with a certain role can then execute the proposal. So to illustrate that, you might have a person who makes a proposal like, let's send 100 WACT token to Bob. And then everyone in the DAO says yes or no. And then using Patterson commitments, we basically sum all those yes-no votes. We can know, without knowing who sent the votes, what the ratio is of yes to no votes. And depending on how we've configured the DAO, that proposal will either pass or fail. So that's, in a way, a friend of mine described it as like the most basic, like minimal viable DAO. It's like the purest DAO because it's just sending money from a treasury with a group of people involved in that decision. But what's really cool is because DarkFi is programmable, and those I mentioned earlier, you have these bullas where you have like a lot of information. What you put inside those bullas is like arbitrary data. You can put anything in there. So you can put contract calls and so on. And you can actually chain smart contract calls together inside of a transaction. So you can make really interesting complex logic. Like you could have a DAO which says something along the lines of, if this proposal passes to, say they're like entering it, the DAO is like entering into some position, or maybe they're making a swap, then they can purchase like another thing using this, using the smart contracts. So you're like chaining contract calls. And also you could use this to do stuff like protocol-owned liquidity, on-chain anonymous protocol-owned liquidity. So that's kind of really interesting element potentially of DeFi, kind of DeFi building block as well. Yeah, and so you may have heard this quote before. In DarkFi, we often say, let there be dark. I hope that what I've made you realize in this presentation, I don't know how clear those connecting threads were, but I was trying to say basically that we've lived in a time of kind of mass desertification. I think we're moving into a time of reforestation, And tools like DarkFi that enable people to kind of take back their power and give communities voice again and an ability to operate in an uncensored, anonymous way will play a part in this this global process of reforestation. So thanks very much.
Thank you. We have time for questions. Yes.
This is a cool project. I had a question about the DAO part. So what about some of the basic kind of DAO attacks? Like suppose I go in, I get a bunch of addresses, I buy a bunch of tokens, I submit a proposal to distribute the treasury to me. I do that at a time of low participation. So there's all these classic problems that DAOs face like that. And I'm wondering how, whether you've thought through some of those problems you probably have and how you address this when there's such a high degree of anonymity.
Yeah. So I just remembered when you spoke that directly after this talk, my good friend Silke is doing a presentation on Assange DAO, which I also was part of. And I recommend everyone should stay and see Silke's presentation as well. But to answer your question, so we have looked a lot at the governance of, there's a particular thing on ETH called OZ Governor. It's a kind of a governance standard made by the Zeppelin community. And so we've looked at that and we've drawn some things from there that is like helpful in what you're saying. So you can have, you can give the proposer making rights to like particular participants within the DAO. So you can make it so, depending on the DAO, like you configure the DAO to your needs, but you can make it so that it's not everyone who's able to make a proposal. Maybe there's like a privileged group. And so if you have a DAO where you're like a little bit sus about the operational security of the DAO and you don't want the treasury getting rugged, you can say, okay, some people will, only a few will post these malicious proposals, so you restrict the people who can do that. In terms of then this general problem of like essentially being able to like buy up governance tokens, that's a general problem of token weighted governance. The DarkFi DAO is token weighted governance, so we don't have a solution to the problems of token weighted governance within DarkFi because we are that. But there are interesting things like on Ethereum, such as quadratic voting, where they say like, okay, we don't want the ability of huge token holders to influence the outcome of a vote. So we're going to weight it disproportionately toward the smaller guys, to kind of balance the will of the bigger groups. However, these kind of approaches require a strong identity, basically. So in Ethereum, there's like one famous project that does this is Gitcoin. They use something called Gitcoin Passport, which is like you can integrate your GitHub and like your Gmail, and then you can have these strong identities that we can use to see who's an individual actor in the DAO. We're very anti-identity. We think this is like the wrong way of thinking. We want to go the other way, which is towards like full anonymity, like zero identity, weak identity. You know, there are some problems that emerge from this, but we think that the benefits vastly outweigh the risks of that.
I'm curious about the architecture of the project, like the overall architecture. For example, there was a slide a few slides ago where you said that you were working on many things, like, for example, in IRCD and many other things like this. I'm curious, what is the rationale for developing it like as one integrated project as opposed to, I mean, there are many IRCDs out there, right? Why put everything together? Is there a specific rationale?
I mean, I can give you the way that I would think about that. But I'll start with a bit of context, which is, you know, when we set out to build DarkFi, we weren't planning to build like a chat that we were forced to, because early days we started using Matrix early days, and we had a lot of issues. First we were kicked off a Matrix server So we had to migrate, and then we were trying to do encrypted chats, and because they had too many members, there was like a lag of 10 seconds between each message. And so we had these kind of constant bugs. We eventually said, like, let's just make something really simple. You know, we can take the existing IRC protocol and we can make it peer-to-peer, which is kind of how IRC was supposed to be, but it became, you know, moved toward the client-server paradigm. So we were like, let's do that. We did that. We use it all the time. So every week we do our dev meetings on there. We live on there. So it's the center of our community. And I think, you know, others in the project might give you a different kind of explanation as to why we have kind of construed of a product around this. But for me, it's like, it's because the DarkFi applications like flow outward from the community that is using DarkFi. So the community is like the primary thing, and then the functionalities are just things that the community has. So like making the chat the center is kind of reinforcing this idea of like, you know, this community first, this community building approach. Yeah, so that's the vision, but also we want to design it in such a way that it's kind of highly modular. So I forgot to mention the DarkFi design philosophy, software design philosophy, which is very much in line with the Unix philosophy. We make everything, you know, very separate, very simple. We try to minimize complexity as much as possible. We try to minimize dependencies. We've been like extremely militant about that. And to the degree that like on DarkFi, we organize it's a Rust project, so we organize the cargo TOML into features. So you can opt out of DarkFi features that you don't want. So like, for example, you can imagine this in the context of transports, where you might just want to run like whatever, TCP, and you don't care about the Tor dependencies. So you can actually disable that, and so on. So we're separating these things. And so the UI experience, like the vision, and we're obviously not there yet, but the vision is like you have a unified AI, like Blender, where you have like the different kind of panels, and you can drag and drop like different DarkFi applications. So you could have like the chat on one side and the task management there. Or if you don't care about the chat and you don't care about the task management, you know, you can just have your wallet open. But it's configurable. The windows are configurable, so you just like swap things out. That's the vision. But we're early stage, you know, we start with the chat and we slowly start to add functionality. But we will also like build the goal, I think, and the goal of all development like should be to like releasing is an interactive process. So we will like trial these things out with the community, like get feedback, adjust. So yeah, we're at the very, very early stages of that release process.
Okay. We have time for one more question, please, if someone has a question. Yes.
This question might not be interesting to the audience, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to follow up on the quadratic voting. So you identified the major problem, which is the identity problem. So one of the problems I gave to my students last spring is if you had Ethereum and if it was the DAO, and if people were voting with 1 ETH, and you wanted to do a Sybil attack using quadratic voting, how much money would you need? It's about $200 because you buy units of 10 to the minus 18th, which is the smallest unit. Take the square root of that, it increases by 10 to the 9th power. And so then, I mean, this is fascinating because if you put that anonymity in and you're not going to use the strong identity things, it just opens you wide up to a Sybil attack to raid the treasury, even with quadratic voting. So I'm just really curious, like this is a fascinating project because you add the anonymity, the DAO problems that are hard as it is, you add the really admirable commitment to anonymity, it makes it even harder. So I'm going to be really interested in how you pull it off.
So I agree that it makes the challenges around identity significantly harder because we want to destroy identities online. But it also opens up new possibilities that weren't otherwise possible. So in the next talk, you will see Silke talking about our experience with the Assange DAO. Assange DAO was highly informative to us on the limitations of transparent DAOs. one reason, Assange, political prisoner, the very fact of coordinating to free Assange was putting all of the DAO participants in liability, and especially the multi-sig, which is like the kind of core people in charge of the treasury. So on DarkFi, we removed that liability, which means we kind of open the doors to all sorts of DAOs that otherwise wouldn't be possible. Especially interesting given the whole kind of shifting regulatory environment and so on. The second thing that was interesting about the Assange DAO was that Assange DAO was participating in a auction for an NFT by a digital artist called Pack. What was messed up though was that our treasury size was known because it's viewable on chain by everyone. So what ended up happening was this basically broke the game theory of the auction that we were involved in. No one wanted to bid against us because everyone knew our max bid. The same thing happened with Constitution DAO, except for Constitution DAO had the opposite problem to Assange DAO. Constitution DAO kind of underraised and then were outbid at the last minute by someone who had just waited for them to place their bid and then just bid a little bit higher at the end. For us, it was more a case of we had raised a huge treasury and everyone was like, why would I bother, putting down my small 1 ETH or whatever it happened to be when there's this like giant treasury that's just going to drop in at any moment and crush all the other bidders. So auctions require information asymmetry. Not just auctions, but various things within markets require information asymmetry. So DarkFi is kind of like reintroducing all of this, all of this potential, a financial market potential that isn't currently possible on the crypto paradigm. And also, I want to mention that the way I think about these DAOs is oftentimes when people hear anonymous DAO, they start thinking about people who don't know each other that are coordinating online, and that is one type of DAO. There are such DAOs that are like purely online and they have like a Discord and, no one knows each other. They're all under pseudonyms and so on. But the DAO that I'm familiar with that my experience at DAOs is like actually quite different. So generally the DAOs that I've been part of, you tend to know who each other are, like the core members. The broader community, you might not know all of them, but the people who are like, in the case of ETH, holding the keys for the multi-sig, you generally know who all of them are, generally. Not always. But so what I imagine is like, if you're like a political organization, you're going to know your own community. So you can have like a community that's like actually a kind of trust-based community that is empowered by these DAO tools. Then you could just restrict, for example, the proposer rights to that group. You could even restrict the governance tokens to that group if you wanted to have like an extremely isolated kind of DAO. But yeah, depending on the DAO, you might also want to have like a Wild West DAO where like everyone has tokens and everyone has proposer rights and so on. And then new kinds of ways of vetting proposals would need to emerge. So it mentioned, I think in Amir's presentation, he was talking about the challenges and the kind of exciting, strange impact of having a fully anonymous chat. And one of them is like you can have people impersonating each other. And so like when you see an impersonation, how do you resolve that? One way is you have like a encrypted DM set up with that person and you can verify their identity that way, or in one of the channels that that person is in. That's one way. But also, you need to be kind of more critically aware of the fact that there could be spammers and scammers on the network. So you're like, oh, actually this person who's appearing as my friend could be any person because this is a fully anonymous chat app. So like I have to be kind of conscious of that. And the same might be true of this new anonymous DAO space. If you were to do a Wild West DAO, which is like full community governance, then you might also need to be extremely vigilant about what proposals you're saying yes to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.